If you have not gotten some lunch, we have very nice sandwiches over here, so feel free to get up and get something to eat, and cookies and coffee. And food will go to waste if you don't eat it. This is my Jewish mother. Eat, you should eat, you all look skinny. All right, thank you everybody for coming today. I know it's the week before Thanksgiving and I'm already feeling like it's the end of the semester. But it's always very positive, I think, to hear about people's research in these tough budgetary times when we're stressed out about that, and to hear what's going on, like why are we here? We're here because we are researchers and scholars and we have exciting insights. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then they will each speak for 25-30 minutes, which should leave plenty of time for Q&A, we hope. And we'll do Q&A after they each speak. By the way, I have another flyer for our next upcoming event, which is December 6th, which is Victoria Ford Smith, who has published a book. So she will be speaking about her book, which is called Between Generations, Collaborative Authorship in the Golden Age of Children's Literature. So pass that around to me. Thank you, Claire. So I was thinking with this panel of highlighting interdisciplinary research, but also trying to get us to think a little bit about the stakes of interdisciplinary research. What are the advantages of crossing disciplinary boundaries? What are the challenges? I know that I like Chris's, Chris's title, Did I Pick the Wrong Discipline, is kind of funny, but you know, we do get challenges when we cross disciplinary boundaries, but also what is at stake in doing this kind of research, especially now, where we're kind of called on often to think about what is the advantage of humanities in general, and to not be siloed in our own disciplinary boundaries. So we will be considering some of these questions about what's at stake in interdisciplinary research, and what kind of research people are engaging in and how they got their training, things like that. And so our two speakers here today, Dwight is going to go first, and he is an associate professor of English at the University of Connecticut. His first book, Raving at Users, Anti-Finance and the Ethics of Uncertainty in England, 1690 to 1750, was published by the University of Virginia Press in 2016. He is the co-editor with Tara Harney Maharjan of Literature, Interpretation, and Theory. He has recently been nominated for the MLA Executive Forum on Restoration in 18th Century Literature, but he, according to his bio, has done a very bad job campaigning. So if you're a member of this forum, please vote for him. I think actually you don't have to be a member of the forum. I think you can decide what forums you want to vote in. I could be wrong about that.
You have to have decided that.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, so if you're a member, if not, you know, I don't know, just fake it. So he's published articles on economics, literature, and disability studies in PMLA, Philological Quarterly, studies in 18th century culture, religion in the Age of Enlightenment, and elsewhere. He has an article forthcoming in the Bloomsbury Cultural History of Money, and it's currently titled Religion and Money. And this article is related to his talk today, as well as current book project. And his talk is called Reading the Savage in the History of Political Economy, an Undisciplinary Study. And then second, we will have Chris Vials, and he is the Director of American Studies at UConn, so many of you may know him from that. But most of his work thus far has focused on the political left and its impact on U.S. culture in the 20th century. He is the author of the monographs Realism for the Masses, Aesthetics, Popular Front Culture, and U.S. Culture. Popular Front Pluralism in U.S. Culture. And more recently, Hunted by Hitler, Liberals, the Left, and the Fight Against Fascism in the United States, which came out quite timely in 2014. And I think Bob Hasenfrost says Chris gets like $1 every time anybody says fascism these days. Sales on his book. He's also, but I don't mean to imply this because Chris has been thinking about this for a very long time, so it's not trendy in that sense of he just did this current situation. But he's also the editor of American Literature and Transition, 1940 to 1950, which is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press next month. All right. Oh yes, and please, as a reminder, that was really well timed. Turn off your cell phones. All right, awesome. So Dwight's going to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's see. Thanks, Martha, to this Speaker Seminars and Scholarly Symposia Committee for organizing this event. Martha, if you would, just please keep me honest on time. I have a long talk here, but I plan on cutting it short, but I just don't have a clock up here, so let me know when I've got 5 minutes to go. I'd also like to thank Chris, my fellow presenter, and the English department for sponsoring this, and for all of you for being here, which motivated me to organize and assemble some thoughts regarding this project. Invocations and representations of savage society, or what is sometimes referred to as primitive society or native society, there are many names for this society, tell us more about what political economy imagines itself to be than about any particular being or set of beings that inhabits this world or the world of the past. Or so I argue in my current research project, which is going under the title of Becoming Economic Beings, which is a study of how we came to think of ourselves as modern economic subjects with a particular focus on the 18th century Atlantic world. Today I'll be talking about the role played by representations of savages in that process. So to begin, I want you to think back in time to the moment when you were first introduced to the idea that land comprising the United States was acquired from its indigenous inhabitants in a shady deal of some kind. Trading trinkets for land, as it's often thought about. It's probable that you cannot remember the first time that you were told that story because it is, one might say, never heard for the first time. Its resonances being so extensive that even when we do hear it as such, it merely confirms much of what we already think we know about savages, about economics, about Europeans. Apologies, didn't mean to do that. Button I hit to do that. I'm sure if I tried, I couldn't do it again. And while the valences of that tale, as it was once popularly told, are perhaps do in a sense impugn the moral credibility of Europeans in such dealings, the tale rests on a more fundamentally on a preliminary idea of the cleverness of the European, a prudential economism that is before and beyond good and evil. Let's see. Okay, so. This is how the savage, as you might imagine, it is often portrayed in 18th century culture as merciless. This is George Cruikshank's representation of the Hottentots, a kind of cautionary tale for people, and of course Hottentots are pejorative, but that's the title of the print. A cautionary tale for would-be emigres to Africa. They are cannibalistic, inhuman, voracious, sexually appetitive, marauding, and so forth. But there is another myth of the savage that is perhaps better emblematized by this portrait entitled Dutch Wait, which is an illustration from an early 19th century text by Washington Irving called The History of New York. And in it, it's an illustration of a moment where we see two natives disappointed to learn that, surprisingly, and the look of surprise on their faces seems evident, that the pile of beaver pelts that they have brought only weighs 2 pounds. Which is a pitiable amount to them, but it's what the Dutch merchants have told the natives the Dutch foot weighs. Which is to say, the image is about them being too credulous and too stupid to understand that the Dutch merchant here is applying his full weight to the scale and thus tipping it in his own favor every time they come to trade. So, is this a moral lesson against shady dealings in the Dutch commerce, or is it an object lesson in the inferiority of the savage mind? Well, it's clearly both. I'll be focusing on the latter of these two. So there are a couple of different conversations before I actually get into the meat of this talk to which I imagine this project as contributing, some of which are for me just coming into focus. And in the written version of this research, I intend to address them in greater detail, but I thought I would mention them preliminarily here. The first concerns the question about the invention of the primitive society as an anthropological concept. Most writers who work in the field of anthropology, with some notable exceptions, argue that this concept is primarily a late 19th and 20th century disciplinary event. I intend to argue that this is not right, that travel literature and political economy, natural history, and political philosophy of the long 18th century are largely responsible for the invention as it comes down to us today. And second, I aim to correct a certain Foucauldian error in how the savage functions in the literature of political economy, which he elaborates in his lectures on biopolitics, where he argues that essentially the savage figure is a trade partner. It's fundamentally conceptualized as a trade partner, which he defines against the barbarian in an attempt to make the distinction between the classical liberal and neoliberal subject more evident. The savage in the literature, as I understand it, however, is relentlessly figured as an incompetent trading partner, and this painting is a case in point. It is the savage as dupe. So some of these thoughts were already percolating during the writing of Raving at Users, which, among other things, makes the claim that capitalism and Christianity were more compatible with one another than the familiar story of progressive disenchantment would have it. The question that I had then, but didn't answer there, was as follows. If the capitalist subject was in fact religious in a certain sense, in the sense that he or she was willing to put his or her hands into an uncertain external determining agency, sometimes figured as providence, how did we come to think of the economic subject as essentially secular? What accounts, that is, for the apparent secularity of the economy? One answer that presented itself to me concerned the way in which a highly abstract Christian reason seemed to often stand in opposition to what were deemed as the extravagant and debased rituals of primitive cultures, cultures who were relatedly marked by economic irrationality. So, for instance, consider the following quotation from Dugald Stewart, and I'm going to just kind of go through a number of writers of the Scottish Enlightenment without biographical introduction. So just take my word for it, these people all wrote from roughly 1770 to 1820. Wherein he justifies the political economy of reason in terms of its opposition to the depravity of rude tribes. It is indeed the never-failing result of sound philosophy to humble more and more the pride of science before that wisdom which is infinite and divine. Whereas the farther back we carry our researches into those ages of the past, we are the more struck with the numberless insults offered to the most obvious suggestions of nature and reason. We may remark this not only in the moral depravity of rude tribes, but in the universal disposition which they discover to disfigure and distort the bodies of their infants. In one case, new modeling the form of the eyelids, in another, lengthening the ears, in a third, checking the growth of the feet, and so forth. To allow the human form to attain in perfection its fair proportions is one of the latest improvements of civilized society. And the case is perfectly analogous in those sciences which have their object to assist nature in the cure of diseases and in the regulations of political economy. Perfectly analogous aptly summarizes the kind of discursive alignment that the Enlightenment proponents of a modern British economic mentality wish to create between, on the one hand, the extravagant rituals of non-British cultures on the one hand, and a defective or unnatural understanding of political economy on the other. The logic for writers like Stewart was essentially the same, and any sign of body modification for ritual purposes was just as surely evidence of one's inability to be effective within the space of the market. The same impulse that prompted the savage to interfere with the natural development of the human form would no doubt lead to rash interferences in the market process. But if primitives were associated with bad religious ritual and bad economics, the question remains how it was possible for moderns to at once embrace religion and to consider themselves as superior in an economic sense. There's no simple answer to this, and different subjects surely reconciled their spirituality with their commercial activities in different ways. But if we were to paint in broad strokes, we might say that what distinguished British religious economy from primitive religious anti-economy was the comparatively denuded character of the Protestant God, here abstracted by Stewart into, quote, that wisdom which is infinite and divine, unquote. The God of the Protestants lent itself to a quick and easy transposition into nature, such as that we find in the famous Index of Political Economy, wherein McCulloch, the compiler, silently translates all of, say, Thomas Hobbes' uses of the word God into nature. By contrast, the brute and intentionally graphic quality of the primitive rituals, such as the one listed by Stewart, and writers of his ilk, rendered their ritual and their religion more or less untranslatable into anything other than forms of unreason and hypervisible pagan rite, which is to say, only back into itself. Unlike the heathen gods, whose determinate characteristics open them up to ridicule and insult, satire conduced by the concreteness of their manifestation, And unlike heathen ritual, which, when compared to the comparatively sterile Protestant ceremonies, at least as they appeared to Protestants, took on a similar degree of concreteness in those rituals' attitudes towards both bodies and the natural world, in contrast to these, the Protestant God and the Protestant ritual appeared relatively abstract in theory and aloof in practice. What enabled moderns to think of their religion as non-religious in a primitive sense was that its God could be conceptually transformed into natural phenomena, and natural phenomena could be translated into God. No surprise there, that is basic deism. It is the way in which such a figure operates in relation to the thoughts and behaviors of primitives that interests me. For the savage, the primitive, the native, the heathen, the pagan, as they were described, their rites resisted metaphorization. As they were described, their gods remained tragically mired in earth, wood, and fire. As they were described, they retained a base materiality that echoed the base minds of those who venerated such gods. And as they were described, their deities extended into space and time only as far as the limited geospatial and temporal imagination of the primitive could mentally accommodate. Writers from a variety of traditions and cultures drew upon this basic set of ideas, this basic formula for representation. Famously, for Rousseau, the savage's, quote, soul, which nothing disturbs, is wholly wrapped up in the feeling of its present existence, without any idea of the future, however near at hand, while his projects, as limited as his views, hardly extend to the close of day. Such, even at present, is the extent of the native Caribbean's foresight. He will improvidently sell you his cotton bed in the morning and come crying in the evening to buy it again, not having foreseen he would want it again the next night, unquote. Once again, the primitive is associated with an inability to conceptualize and prudently manage future contingency. This was a refrain that resounded across the landscape of late 18th century print culture. Hence, William Robertson, author of the tremendously popular History of America, though by all accounts he was never there, what among polished nations is called reasoning or research is altogether unknown in the rude state of society. The thoughts and attention of a savage are confined within the small circle of objects immediately conducive to his preservation or enjoyment. Everything beyond that escapes his observation or is perfectly indifferent to him. Like a mere animal, what is before his eyes interests and affects him. What is out of sight or at a distance makes no impression. There are several people in America whose limited understanding seem not to be capable of formulating an arrangement for futurity. Neither their solicitude nor their foresight extend so far. They follow blindly the impulse of the appetite which they feel, but are entirely regardless of distant consequences, and even of those removed in the least degree from immediate apprehension, while they highly prize such things as serve present use or minister to present enjoyment. They set no value upon those which are not the object of some immediate want, unquote. The idea could be clearly seen as well in Adam Ferguson's essay on the history of civil society, the text that is often credited as having invented the stadial system of history. It must appear very evident that property is a matter of progress. It requires, among other particulars, which are the effects of time, some method of defining possession. The very desire of it proceeds from experience, and the industry by which it is gained or improved requires such a habit of acting with a view to distant objects as may overcome the present disposition either to sloth or to enjoyment. This habit is slowly acquired and is in reality a principal distinction of nations in the advanced state of mechanic and commercial arts. This intellectual deficiency and inability to understand or comprehend the future was, in turn, seen as the reason for the baseness of primitive religion. As Hume put it, when the sources of one's misery are, quote, invisible and unknown, the methods taken to appease them are equally unaccountable and consist in ceremonies, observances, mortifications, sacrifices, presents, or in any practice, however absurd or frivolous, which either folly or knavery recommends to a blind and terrified credulity. Weakness, fear, melancholy, together with ignorance, are therefore the true sources of superstition, unquote. In fact, what is most notable about the assessments of the defective temporal imagination of non-British others, and incidentally, if you've lost track of which natives I'm referring to, that's kind of the point. There was a conflationary tendency that I would talk about at greater length if time permitting. What is notable about these assessments is the refrain remains unchanged. John Millar, in his Origins of the Distinction of Ranks, would write of an indiscriminate savage who, quote, arrives at the end of his wishes before they have sufficiently occupied his thoughts or engaged him in those delightful anticipations of happiness which the imagination is apt to display in the most flattering colors, unquote. And James Burnet, Lord Mombodo, who as a celebrated horse breeder felt entitled to share his opinion regarding the choice of wives with James Boswell, argued that, quote, the narrow scope of the Huron peoples made it unnecessary for them to develop a complex language, since a less complex system of signification was suitable for the immediate needs and wants of primitive society. As a way of pursuing into the 19th century this complex affiliation of the religious and economic defects of the great mass of humanity beyond Britain, we might consider Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history, in which it is argued that the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit of Africa is intimately connected with the deficient conception of property because of the African's inability to see himself from without, to see himself from a distance and understand himself as an objective reality. But more to the purpose here would be the writings of the explorers Richard Francis Burton and James Hanning Speke. This is partly because they show the legacy of the Enlightenment construction of the primitive mind, but also because they reveal the toxic forms of racial scientific understanding to which such notions gave rise. The East African, according to Burton, has stopped short at the threshold of progress. He shows no signs of development. No higher and more varied orders of intellect are called into being. Even the simple truths of el-Islam have failed to fix the thoughts of men who can think, but who, absorbed in providing for their bodily wants, hate the trouble of thinking. His mind, limited to the objects seen, heard, and felt, will not and apparently cannot escape from the circle of sense, nor will it occupy itself with aught but the present. And again, Speke, Burton's traveling companion, remarked of the freed slaves of Arabians, the Wangwana, that because they are, quote, controlled by no government, nor yet by home ties, they have no reason to think of or look to the future. That economy, care, or forethought never enters his head. The first thing to hand is the right thing for him. Similarly, according to Speke, experience will not teach the Negro who thinks only for the moment, unquote. Now, this inability to think beyond the present was unsurprisingly linked to more specific forms of economic deviance, gambling being the most important, because it gathered together the scattered thoughts on savage economy with the equally scattered images of savage religion and superstition. For the travel writer Jonathan Carver, quote, tribes of Negroes are much addicted to gaming. And Charles Middleton speaks of gambling as, quote, a vice to which the people of Congo are greatly addicted. And of the people of Sumatra, he affirms that they are, quote, naturally addicted to gambling. Concerning the native people of Ceylon, or present-day Sri Lanka, the geographer Daniel Fenning, who also not ever left England at all, writes the following, history of the world basically, writes the following, fusing an account of economic irrationality with a tale of self-inflicted corporeal violence to signify an epistemological alterity that I would argue operates at the level of religion. Their passion for play, which is to say gambling, is carried to such an extent, such an extravagant length, that the game of drafts, they venture not only all they have in the world, but even their very limbs. When they have nothing more to lose, they set a vessel full of sesame or oil of nuts, for they have not olives, on the fire, and by its side a small axe, but very sharp. He who loses lays his hand upon a stone, and they cut off the joint of a finger, which is immediately dipped in the boiling oil in order to cauterize the wound. It reminds me, I actually cut off the tip of my finger last night as I was finishing the papers. A side point. If the religion isn't evident enough in Fenning, we see it more clearly here in Louis Armand's memoirs of his travels to America. There is another sort among Native Americans that is yet worse. I won't bother with what was just bad in the previous paragraph. Namely, the magicians, who converse in a familiar way with the evil spirit and get him to appear in what figure they please to those who have the curiosity to see him. They have secret charms that will procure good luck at gaming and enrich those upon whom they are bestowed. They foretell futurities and have the power to transform themselves into all sorts of animals and the most frightful figures. The toxic fusion of primitive superstition and economic irrationality was also the most useful rhetorical landing zone for those committed to the production of economic subjectivity in Britain, because they could see the ways in which Britons themselves were not living up to the expectations of a modern commercial society. In the casual play of the ordinary European, the savage, it would seem, had come home to roost. In the words of William Russell, it is easy to see how what presents itself as a portrayal of the savage could easily double back as conduct literature respecting the moral value of industry and labor for the British reader. An immoderate love of play, especially at games of hazard, which seems to be natural to all people unaccustomed to the occupations of regular industry, is likewise so universal among the North Americans. The same causes which so often prompt persons at their ease in civilized life to have recourse to this pastime render it the delight of the savage. The former are independent of labor, the latter does not feel the necessity of it. And as both are unemployed, they run with transport to whatever can stir and agitate their minds. Hence the Indians, who at other times are so indifferent and phlegmatic, so silent and so disinterested, as soon as they engage in play become rapacious, impatient, noisy, and almost frantic with eagerness, starkly contrasting with Dew's commerce, which is sort of the thesis of Hirschman's passions and the interests. Their furs, their domestic utensils, their clothes, arms are staked at the gaming table. They tear their hair and beat their breast while the throw is depending. And when all is lost, high as their sense of independence is, in a wild emotion of despair or of hope, they will often risk their personal liberty upon a single case. And it wasn't just industry and labor, but an epistemology of the future that was at stake in such literature. How to produce a subject whose principal concern was the cautious management of future time. As the Abbé Raynal put it in the history of the British settlements in North America, these savages are wholly taken up with the present passion, are extravagantly fond of gaming, as is usual with all idle people, and especially of games of chance. Destitute of almost everything, coveting all they see, and when they like it, eager to have and enjoy it, they give themselves up entirely to the quickest and easiest means of acquiring it. This is a consequence of their manners as well as of their character. The sight of present happiness always blinds them as to the evils that may ensue. Their forecast does not even reach day to night. They are alternately silly children and terrible men. All depends with them on the present moment. Now, to conclude, texts such as these help Britons to forget the hazardous proximity of gambling and investment that had been loudly announced on various occasions of financial crisis over the course of the 18th century, such as during the South Sea Bubble, when investment was routinely figured as a kind of gambling activity. Matched up against such extravagant spectacles of violent losses as those recorded in travel literature, in political economy, political philosophy, natural history of the period, the palpably austere taking of risks in stocks and annuities and other instruments of financial business would have seemed a model of British moral rectitude and propriety. But the literature concerning savage mentalities, savage commerce, and savage gambling did more than make finance look good. It paradoxically made British religious devotion look good too. Accusations of a native fixation on the magical aspects of gambling helped to make invisible the supernaturalism implicit in the droning British rhetoric of providentialism that underwrote British commercial experience as well as the imperial project writ large. For however much references to the deity may seem or may have seemed a pious reflex than a genuine expression of faith, the attendance and supervision of providence at the site of commerce and empire was nevertheless compulsory. How to keep the Christian God in a secular marketplace, one that looked kind of like gambling and kind of looked like a profane gaming table. This was a complex negotiation, to say the least. Such moves by writers from Ferguson and Smith to Burton and Speke to cast the primitive mind as devoid of an understanding of futurity drew upon characterizations of the irrationality of the primitive that grew out of an unmistakable astonishment with the superstitions and rituals of a monolithic non-Protestant world. Those moves also fed back into celebrations of the prudential and industrial character of the modern Briton, as well as the definition of the modern as prudent and therefore able to hedge against risk and cautiously plan for his or her family's future. Actually, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Does anybody want me to open some windows? Are people hot? No? Yes? Okay. All right.
I kind of wanted to have this picture of Lord James hovering over us. Do you want this off?
Yeah, sure.
I'll just
thoroughly all right, thank you guys for coming out, and thank you, Martha, for organizing this panel. Thank you, Dwight. I know you had a lot of other things you could be doing this afternoon, so I appreciate you devoting it to our talk. And I guess my talk is maybe a little bit of a different structure. I'll be talking about my own work in specific details just in the first minute or so, or a minute or two, and then I'll be cutting really more to a discussion of my journey to interdisciplinarity, which I imagine you can kind of compare to your own in the Q&A. And it's titled, Did I Pick the Wrong Discipline? Interdisciplinary Scholarship and the Boundaries of the Modern University. And so I guess I'm going to begin with a provocative but honest statement, but then with several qualifiers, which is, I'm in an English department, but I grew really, really bored with being a literary scholar, so I stopped being that. My publications have started to reflect that boredom. I was a little surprised, but not shocked to see that my second monograph, Haunted by Hitler, had this marketing label U.S. History on the back. One of the readers was a historian, and when it was reviewed thankfully well in the OAH's Journal of American History, and in Germany's Zeitschrift für Geschichtswissenschaft. And I've since become a reader for the Journal of American History, and the project I'm working on now, the U.S. Anti-Fascism Reader, it's a primary source reader composed mostly of social movement-based writings and political theory on the subject of fascism and anti-fascist strategy, mostly penned by Americans. And it will not likely contain a single literary work, although maybe it might have 10 pages of It Can't Happen Here if we can get the permissions at a decent rate. I get to do this kind of work now, post-tenure, after performing as a literary scholar for a good bit of my adult life. All that said, here's the important qualifier, which is I don't want to be barred from being a literary scholar because I still occasionally like writing about literature, and I still love teaching literature in the classroom, mainly because it allows you to explore the texture of a historical moment and to explore ethical action in concrete situations, and to explore historical contingency like nothing else. And I'm channeling Raymond Williams here, but I see cultural production as a rich refraction of lived experience, and to me, no concept sums up the importance of cultural production more than his concept of the structure of feeling. Yet, and I didn't know, Alexis, you were going to be in the room, actually, before I said this, but is she still here, or did she just walk out? Oh, there, I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm reminded here of something told to me one day by my friend and colleague Alexis Boylan, art historian and American Studies comrade here at UConn, when she explained why she went over to American Studies, which she said, American Studies is for people who still love their discipline, but want to date other people. And there is sometimes a feeling of guilt that comes with this. And that is the idea that I should be studying literature after all. It was an English department that gave me my job. And to be sure, there are people at the university who try to remind you of your place, and that's another story. But then I reflect that because of the job market, when I reflect that I had to fit myself into this disciplinary structure, and I didn't ask for a world in which English was over here, and history was over there, political science was over here, economics was over there. If I had my druthers, knowledge would be organized very differently, and not according to the epistemologies of the 19th century, rooted in capitalism, colonialism, and the needs of their corresponding states, but otherwise. And so I'm going to get just a kind of a brief, just exploratory sample of disciplinary history here. And if you're interested in Emanuel Wallerstein's Introduction to World Systems Theory has this great 10-page opener that he begins by explaining the history of world systems theory. And most of this would just begin with our field, but he begins with when man put pen to paper. And so he's got this great 10-page dense explanation of how all the disciplines became how they are. And I'm kind of taking a lot of it from this. We learned from Wallerstein about the division of knowledge in the medieval university, which was a roadmap of medieval thought, and how most of our contemporary epistemological divisions are just as much of a roadmap of our own dominant orders. Or, if we take Wallerstein at his word, Many of the disciplinary divisions that mark the contemporary university are more of a roadmap to the dominant thought in the 19th century, or in perhaps need of rethinking. The story he tells is a story of historical emergence, as recently as the 19th century, of the division between the sciences and the humanities, with one division devoted to empirical research and the testing of hypotheses, and the other devoted to empathetic insight and hermeneutic understanding. We learn of further subdivisions of the nomenthetic disciplines devoted ultimately to discovering natural laws, and these included many of the early social sciences of sociology, economics, and political science. Within these disciplines and from sources other than Wallerstein, we can learn of the historic split between political science and economics, which used to be united under the banner of political economy. And this split in itself of political science over here that studies the state and economics over here that studies the economy, as if those two things were separable, tells us a lot about kind of modern thought, and modern dominant thought particularly. In contrast to the nomenthetic disciplines, there are the contrasting idiographic disciplines devoted to studying the uniqueness of social phenomena, which included history and the rest of the humanities, and increasingly parts of social science and sociology as well. Significantly, we learn from Wallerstein, for example, and I'm just giving over this for a sample of the arbitrariness of the boundaries. History and social sciences were born of revolution. A key example here is the academic discipline of history, which grew from the urgency of understanding the French Revolution. And after the French Revolution, because of the need to understand this new category of the people and how they operate, history moved from hagiography into a more empirical yet still idiographic discipline, as well as from the notion imparted by that revolution that historical upheaval was normal, not exceptional, and that the people were the sovereign subject of history. Now, other disciplines emerged from the new modes of exploitation. European colonialism gave rise to the disciplines of anthropology and Orientalism, which required the creation of knowledge about subject peoples in the colonies, as Said and others understood well. And then there's English, right? Not unrelated to that colonial project, born of the late Victorian period, but only becoming generalized in the university level in the early 20th century, as Terry Eagleton documented so well in his classic Rise of English. English to Eagleton was initially a Victorian project which inherited Romanticism's separation of imaginative writings from other kinds of written texts. It was initially devoted to civilizing an unruly working class in an era of insurgent working class demands, and its project of empathetic understanding was rooted in that project. Eagleton famously wrote, quote, "Literature would rehearse the masses in the habits of pluralistic thought and feeling, persuading them to acknowledge that more than one viewpoint than theirs existed, namely that of their masters." Early 20th century English departments would shift their function to helping their students survive in trashy worlds of debased consumer culture, yet not lose this civilizing impulse entirely. In returning to the present, I'm just giving that brief overview. Obviously, I don't have time to go over the history of the disciplines in ways I'm not even an expert on in this little short talk, but I'm rehearsing that history and outline form, not because I believe that the disciplines are static and forever locked into their original forms, but because, in case in point, something I never tired of telling my students is how the movements of the late 60s and early 70s, most notably the San Francisco State Strike, dramatically transformed the existing disciplines. Women and people of color enter the syllabus as subjects, even in a class on Renaissance drama, because of these movements. But I want to suggest here that we do more not only to offer inclusion within existing structures, but also work to creating new structures entirely, structures more commensurate for the project of liberation, to take that old term from the 20th century. The interdisciplines, for me, the degree of sanity I've been able to retain in academia is thanks to the interdisciplines in large measure. Without American studies in particular, I would simply not be able to teach what I want to teach, nor the material I am qualified to teach here at UConn. I could, but I would have to do so under the radar and against the grain of catalog descriptions, an absurdity I have in fact been doing for much of my time here. And hopefully this will change thanks to new course action requests that are floating through the system, right? But I came to the Academy as a self-identified anarchist or Marxist, I wasn't sure which, who wanted to understand how exploitation and oppression worked and how to fight them and create a new world. And I wanted a space to explore those questions that my 9-to-5 job was not offering me. I've always divided up my reading between literature, history, and philosophy, political theory, and I've been quite messy in terms of the national where. Yet, when forced to spatially select, the US seemed as good a place to start since that's where I lived and that was the global hegemonic power. I guess I moved towards being an Americanist specifically after reading a little quoted history from the 1970s, labor historian Jeremy Brucker's book, Strike! It was basically a history of strikes in the United States, particularly in the late 19th century and early 20th. And I had been interested in distant revolutions in Russia, Germany in 1918, Cuba, Mexico. But this was about very radical forms of class struggle in places like Palestine, Texas, and in the not seemingly revolutionary decades like the 1870s, or Toledo, Ohio in 1919, Minneapolis in the 1930s, and there was this realization that, wow, I mean, we've had these kind of radical struggles, revolutionary struggles even right here, in this country. And I guess I started to devote myself to that slogan from New Left historians, dig where you are, right? But in any case, American Studies was liberation for me because it allowed a question-based approach. That is, I think a lot of the interdisciplines do this, is that you set out with a question, and for me in my last book it was, what is fascism and how is it manifested in the United States? And you read whatever you need to read in order to answer it, regardless of the discipline. And the question itself is your ordering principle, right? American Studies itself began as a Cold War project in the 1940s and 50s, and even the interdisciplines have their baggage. But interestingly, it's become home to other people driven by questions of exploitation and resistance, similar to my own, and who don't care what they read in order to answer them. The spatial limitations, and this goes to the question of how do we reorganize the disciplines, and I don't have a full answer to this. You have to have some kind of ordering principle. Each comes with its perils. But I will say about American Studies, for me, the spatial limitation of the United States has proven less and less of an obstacle, in the sense that I just chaired a panel at the American Studies Association with Robin D.G. Kelly and others on the afterlives of the Russian Revolution. And we were schooled that it should be the October Revolution for various reasons, but it was focused on the global impact of that revolution on struggles for national liberation, and the conversation seamlessly shifted from Russia to Central Asia to Ghana to China to Newark and Los Angeles and back. And here I should note something institutionally important about the interdisciplines, and I'm here referring not just to the Executive Committee of the American Studies, but to ethnic studies disciplines at UConn, like Asian and Asian American Studies, Africana Studies, WGSS, El Instituto, and that is at department and unit head meetings here at UConn. These interdisciplines are some of the only places with people of color or women in leadership positions, right? And they're not always havens of sanity for their faculty. And I'm looking at Alexis as I say this again. But in keeping with the national liberation thrust of the late 60s that created them, they are spaces where work on race or sexuality goes from being a minority concern to a majority concern, and where queer and non-white bodies go from being minorities to majorities, with all that enables and allows. Now, the American Studies Association National Conference is not without its problems, but it is a place where heterosexual white scholars have to make their work legible in very real ways to people who are neither heterosexual nor white. And yes, new forms of knowledge is incubated in such spaces. And in some, I'm optimistic about the future, in part because the book publishing market prizes interdisciplinary work much more than pure literary criticism, which does give a massive institutional boost to the kinds of scholarship I like. Yet, most of us still have to apply for jobs within and inhabit the old disciplines, which is the rub. How knowledge in the 21st century should be organized, as I've said, I'm not entirely sure, but for now, I'll keep plugging away and be thankful for the spaces that so many others with similar questions as mine have helped to carve out for me. Thank you.
We have time for questions. I was actually going to start with a question, and I will throw this out to the two of you, but I do think that there's just generally been a shift away from our own prior understanding of what our disciplines were, especially like in the last 10, 15 years. Like, I had a graduate student who said in my class, she finally got to a novel and she said, "Oh, I'm so excited, this is the first novel I've read all semester." And we were like 10 weeks into the semester. And I know in my own research, when I finished my last book, I was surprised to see that Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is the only novel, the only strict literary text I talk about it at the end. So I'm kind of curious about, because it seems like a lot of us are shifting towards an interdisciplinary focus. I'm kind of curious as to what both of you think is, I mean, I wasn't always like that. It sounds like you were always more like that. I'm kind of curious as to what you think is driving this, where I think everybody's, not maybe to the extent that you are, is shifting away from siloed knowledge. Is it a political reality? Is it a better understanding of the way knowledge should circulate and scholarship should be formed? Or something else?
It's hard, the historical question of why now, it's kind of hard to answer. It could be partly because we are further and further away from the 19th and early 20th century worlds that created these boundaries, and so maybe the boundaries are starting to make less and less sense to us epistemologically with kind of new historical changes. You know, be that as it may, I don't think that disciplines really as they exist are going anywhere anytime soon, and so most of us still who do this kind of work still work within their structures, and for the most part, once we get to a certain point in the careers, we can kind of do what we want for the most part. But it's just because of payroll and administrative structures, and you've got existing departments that are built around people paid certain salaries in these divisions. It's very hard, I think, even if we all decided we wanted to be interdisciplinary. A, not everybody wants to, and B, it would just be difficult to change this just because of the materiality of these structures.
Yeah, and I just think, I mean, the notion of a literary, like with respect to English, the notion of, say, a literary discourse that stands apart and can be siloed just is totally untenable. I mean, now, exactly. And I mean, at least I would say that the vein of literary writing that we think of when we think of, say, the tradition or the canon is just so incredibly small in the vast sea of what could be just called imaginative literature. I mean, political economy, for example, is intensely imaginative literature, and its truth claims are every bit as complex and in terms of their ontological status, like what they're claiming when they make a truth claim, as what you get in, say, a piece of didactic fiction or a Popian essay on such and such a topic. So, so I just think that's the problem.
Questions?
I think could we also like have other people in the audience like weigh in on these so that it doesn't just like form. I mean, I don't.
Sure. You want to weigh in?
Well, I mean, as you can probably imagine, I've been thinking a lot about these questions lately, and I mean, this could take up my entire afternoon, and I would still want to keep going. But one of the things that's sort of become increasingly clear to me, and I think is an interesting issue that I never really thought very hard about until I had to kind of move beyond the humanities, is that, and there are obviously exceptions to this. It strikes me that one of the ways that we are still constrained in the humanities with respect to interdisciplinary work as opposed to or disciplinary versus interdisciplinary work is that we still primarily work alone. Right? We still, each of us, work on our scholarship individually. And as much as we want to and can draw upon a range of different disciplinary approaches and question the kinds of conventions of our own disciplines, we're necessarily limited by that factor. Whereas in the sciences, it's almost impossible not to be working on something important in the sciences that is not interdisciplinary, in the sense that you are working with teams of researchers who bring to bear on that particular question or set of questions a range of different disciplinary modalities and skills. And so I would think that one of the ways in which we can kind of push this envelope further in the humanities is also to kind of, is to question much more vigorously the notion of the single individual isolated scholar in whatever he or she is working on.
Maybe it's possible, though, that the collectivity of the humanities manifests at a different place or at a different level of the system. So, for example, I mean, like what Chris was saying about sort of the shifting nature of the book market, right, wanting to be more engaged in interdisciplinary projects. That would argue that there is a kind of collective project at stake that's unfolding. It's just happening across a variety of different individual people's work, but it's manifested, right, in terms of the market for interdisciplinary projects. But I mean, I think you're saying like you should be just actually be working with someone else as we're saying putting together a monograph. And to be honest, I mean, how would you do that?
Well, I mean, I think we would have to reimagine the ways that, I mean, certainly within the institutional constraints that Chris is describing, when it comes to things like appointments and promotion and tenure, where there are still different kinds of standards that are applied in different disciplines, it would have to, those things would have to be challenged. They would have to be reconfigured or gradually evolve to accommodate and credit the sorts of work that can't be exclusively singled out as a peer-reviewed article or a monograph, right? And I think, I mean, it seems to me that digital humanities is a place where that's happening a little bit more, but there's a lot of work that needs to get done.
But I think there's different pressures with the book publishing market. I mean, see a few historians in the room, but quick, correct me if I'm wrong, you could still be a, historian and still get, pretty good, trade press book out there in the world, right? But for literary scholars, it's more a crisis because even as the editor of my first book told me, we just, nobody buys literary criticism books. Not even you guys in English departments. We don't buy a whole book of literary criticism very often, right? And so I think the institutional pressures for us in English specifically are already kind of tending towards going away from siloing for our own kind of tenurability and survival. I don't know if that's uniformly across all disciplines, right? But I mean, I would argue, like you said, I would argue in the humanities and social sciences too, the really important, huge, blockbuster works are what they call the crossover books, right? The cross disciplines and the ones that everybody talks about, whether you're a sociologist or a, and I think things like David Harvey are perfect examples of this. Who's one of the most, I think he's the most widely quoted scholar in all of humanities, social sciences or something, because you read his stuff and you go like, what department are you even in? I don't even know, right? So that's.
Wayne had a comment with your
Martha, I had a question. I like both presentations, but I had a question, Dwight, for you in particular. What do you do with the notion of primitive eloquence? So I'm thinking of Native American oratory or Ossian, the notion of sort of primitive poetry. And then as a sort of follow-up, I'll give you a test case. So Sir William Johnson, who was an Irish immigrant landowner and eventually situated in upstate New York, the British administrator for Indian Affairs in North America. He was meeting with an Iroquois friend of his. He was an adopted Iroquois and had an Iroquois wife and children and lived among the Iroquois in his own big stone mansion. He was telling this friend of his that he'd fallen asleep and had a dream. And the Indian chief said, well, what was your dream? Because, of course, Native Americans had special interest in dreams. And he said, well, I dreamed that you gave me 100,000 acres of land further west on the Mohawk River. And the chief said, right, since you dreamed it and we believe in dreams, I'll give you that land. But, Sir William, there's a condition. Dream me no more dreams. So I think wit shows up there. And it might be an interesting experience because it involves, indeed, bad bargaining or wiliness or whatever, but that story reveals the receiving end being more sophisticated than your
you know.
mythography suggests. So.
Yeah, but I mean, it sounds to me like the genre in which this anecdote is reported is decidedly not the kind of sort of widely read, this is probably related in a letter or something like that, right? This is not the dominant portrayal. I mean, certainly you get the idea that there's a kind of native wisdom that's part of the noble savage sort of myth and all that, right? That they have access to a kind of
I mean,
intelligence.
it is published, though. I mean, I'm thinking of
right.
Cadwallader Colden's History of the Five Indian Nations,
Okay.
dependent on the state of New York. He
Yeah.
tells of a similar occasion where
Yeah.
the natives are overheard referring to the French in Canada as their father, French governor. And the English and the Dutch are very upset by this, and they upbraid the Indian who said this. He said, you know, you're our Indian, you're not his Indian. He said, well, you know, these terms are kind of slippery. They mean nothing. We call him father because he calls us his children, but we don't really believe it.
Interesting.
So, and that is published and widely
yeah.
distributed, and
No,
it shows
that's a
again a
good
kind of
example.
canny negotiating
Right.
ability.
I have no doubt that there aren't exceptions to this. I mean, just as there are many examples of, you know, like I showed in the Crookshank portrait, right, of a very savage, belligerent, kind of monstrous sort of savage figure. I mean, this is just one particular strand that I'm trying to trace, but I'll think about those.
But noble savage, in other words,
Yeah.
would be the opposite side.
Yeah,
of it.
yeah, no,
Thanks.
absolutely. I'll think
Great
about
stuff.
it. Yeah, sorry, those are great references. Thank you.
Garrett? Hi, thank you guys so much for this. I'm particularly struck as a sort of aberrant interdisciplinary 18th centuryist. So I think I have maybe a bit of a cranky question or a bit of a sort of pessimistic question, which is this possible sort of double-edged sword, backlash, reverse discourse of dig where you are. Particularly when certain scholars doing interdisciplinary work are accused of me-search, right? So that this often short circuits or troubles, right? Like a journey into an interdisciplinary space or a WGSS program or Africana Institute, if you can't really sort of trick people on the job market that you do literature. So what do we do with I guess the sort of backlash of digging where you are means different things for different people, and if you are a queer person working in queer theory, wrestling also with disabilities, and your methodology is sort of crip queer, and you're accused of, oh well, you're just researching what you are, right? That is a real problem. And then what does that look like? So I'm wondering sort of how we see that problem, and then what does that look like for the ethics of training graduate students for the market? If we're thinking about including one novel in a grad seminar, what does that look like for the types of jobs that are available and for the sort of ethics of advising? Cranky.
No, not cranky at all. I mean, there's two really very important issues going on. I mean, I can say at least with the New Left historiography moment of dig where you are, I mean, that came out of a kind of a radical 60s idea of transforming everyday life. And this is a very New Left idea. The everyday life and everyday structures is breaking down to the personal and the political, all of these kind of things. So, you might study a history of Yukon just to know where Homer Babbage, how he became evil, and that might be actually kind of what your project might be. And in saying that, I'm not suggesting by any stretch that that's the only valid way. I mean, thank God there's scholars in this country as well doing work on the October Revolution, for example. I mean, you don't have to go that way, but I mean, that was one kind of strategy of transforming everyday life at that moment. But that said, I mean, what the ethnic, or not only the ethnic, but being a kind of a minoritized subject on some level, and this is, I know, a lot of ethnic studies work has kind of focused on this, is that idea that, you cannot make claims to the universal, right, if you are kind of siloed in an interdisciplinary. And that's a larger kind of question of kind of racism and homophobia and all these kind of things where, you could do work in, Africana studies or something like that, your claim might be seen as really particular, but yet if you do work in 17th century British genre, Renaissance, a place that represents maybe 1% of the world's population at that time, you can make claims to the universal, right? So I mean, so that's a broader thing that there needs to be, more cultural work done. But there are some work, I know, at least in ethnic studies, where they're talking about Black universalism and trying to flip that discourse. I'm thinking of Nick Hill Singh's Black as a Country, where they're trying to flip the discourse and talk about all of these, Black thinkers historically who have, flipped that and said, okay, well, we are making claims to the universal, albeit from a situated spot, and so that's. But again, I guess there's a lot of cultural work that has to be done, in that branch. So.
I would just say in response to the second part of your question about advising and sort of, I gather your question is about, how do graduate students prepare for a world beyond disciplines in those traditional senses? And it just seems to me like, in 18th century studies, it's just now it's a question of, problems and concepts more so than, like historical problems, and concepts rather than a question of genres or authors. And, when you go to the National Convention, ASEX, there are very few author-centric panels. There are very few. I think there
Is that
are.
right? I think that's not been my experience at ASEX, nor my experience on the job market.
Right.
But,
I think that there's certainly an expectation that you have a familiarity with the major authors, but here's the thing, the major authors didn't limit themselves to imaginative writing in that traditional sense. Defoe writes 500 works, and about 1% of them could be classed as imaginative writing. He spent most of his life as a newspaper writer. So, and the same goes for Fielding, and the same goes for Richardson. So I guess I would say that, there isn't a premium, as far as I can tell, that's being placed on these authors, maybe because of their status as the writers of great works of capital L literature, but because they were widely read people with significant opinions on the pressing issues of the day, whether that's empire or something else.
I was wondering, as the representative of the department on the CLAS CNC committee, I've had to deal with some of these interdisciplinary course suggestions coming out most notoriously from Chris. And I've gotten some mileage out of saying that an English department is not purely a literature department, it's a rhetoric department, among other things. And I wondered, for both of you, how much of your work in a pinch could you describe as rhetorical analysis?
90%.
No, yes and no. I think I think that's the way we talk about this in English CNC. We try to reframe what we do as English is not so much literature but narrative, right? Because when you think about the introduction of rhetoric and composition and film studies and all of these different fields, that's kind of more where we are. But yeah, I guess it's for me. I think through the CNC process, you learn. I think when you propose a class, you learn where those boundaries are, and you realize how active they still are, right? They're more active in CNC matters and in teaching, I think, than they are in publishing, which is just like, it's a not, you don't have to explain this at all.
Tell
right?
the story about the economics department.
Yeah, you know this, about the economics department just basically said, one of their CNC rep had said, and you're familiar with this, one of them said, like, well, Chris is proposing this class on, capitalism and critics, but he's an English major, right? And I was going, okay, I'm not going to tell him that I've read political economy and all of my whole kind of history. It's wasting my breath, but ultimately still got the class through. But I also had to get it through people like that. I still had to basically make the course description something completely different than what I will do. I'm still playing the game, in the sense that when I go to teach the class, that syllabus is going to look very different from what I pitched to them, just to get it through the hurdles. Now, do I get to still do what I want? Yes. But in this case, that's more of an annoyance than anything else. But at the same time, there still is that policing that goes on, very, very much so through the CNC process.
So just two things, just in my own personal quick answer to Haf's question, I'm working a lot on the law, and I'd say 95% of what I do is still rhetorical.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really glad that you raised the question that you did, and I'm very troubled by it in a really good way. And I don't have an answer to it, but I think that there's the broader question of what should our graduate seminars be, and I want everyone to know that, I mean, I guess I want the grad students to know that we are very actively thinking about this. I'm on the grad exec committee this year, and of course there are a couple of grad representatives, and we are realizing that particularly with all of this shrinkage going on, we really have to rethink what the grad seminars even are. But I mean, even sort of putting that, which is like, and the good thing is, you know, we're going to be looking forward, and so this is a really good time to be thinking about this. But you know, we've been struggling, I think, for some time, and a lot of the Americanists, we talk about this. Like, is it really? Do you guys really want like American literature by these 4 surveys? Is that what you want, or do you want the more special topics? And I don't really know, but it seems to me that there's a lot more interest in taking those special topicsy classes, where you might be 25% literary. So we're talking about it, we're trying to figure it out, and there's no question we need to rethink it.
I'd just add to what Chris said about sort of the material structure of the university and the way economics or another department might intervene. When I was at the University of Iowa, when the English faculty invented a new course, and the title, we would call the registrar, get a number, and that was it.
Yeah.
So I think this is a particularly parochial institution, both in terms of how it's structured internally and maybe in its geographical, cultural position in the United States. So I think that the power that the disciplines hold over curriculum is not a universal. So there are other models. Yeah.
I would take slight issue with that. I mean, I don't know whether Iowa's the same as it was when you were there, or whether it's changed, but my impression is that most of this is driven purely by numbers, which is to say, the reason why the economics department is worried about a course that you're teaching that has economics in it is not because they have some principled notion of what each discipline should be, but because they want to make sure that you're not stealing students. And that they have the same number of students in their classrooms that they have been having, because the resources allocated to their departments are determined exclusively by those numbers. That's happening everywhere. I mean, I don't think that's...
Yeah, but there was not the structure at Iowa that allows the intervention of other disciplines in a review of what a particular department proposes. So that's a different model of university governance and intellectual design. So I'm not sure.
And when you were going through that process, the issue wasn't whether it could be approved. The issue was
Yes.
or was it whether it would be cross-listed as the econ credit? Because I mean, in that case, that would
No,
answer.
it wasn't crosses. I mean, and I will say for the record, it was a political. There was a lot of political stuff into it too, because you know the guy was enjoining me to read all of these kind of Thatcherites things. He was in so there was that going on. Right?
Yeah.
But I wondered that too, and it came from sociology as well. It's like, why the hell are people in sociology and economics telling me I can't teach this damn class? It really depends on the fussiness of individual CNC reps, I think, you know, but at the same time, those CNC reps out of a university, out of a college, of how many faculty are going to be there. So the question does become for me, like, why do some of these departments have this veto power? I have wondered that myself, too.
I mean, I've run into it, too. I mean, when I was teaching, I proposed a course on modern Jewish thought, and I had Spinoza on the list, on the syllabus, and the philosophy department was in hysterics about how could I teach Spinoza? I'm not a philosopher.
That's ridiculous.
You can't use hysterics, that's a psychology.
I think it's hilarious too, because so many of our majors right now are double majors.
Right.
We're majoring and minoring, like English and anthropology. English and
Undergraduates
history,
are all interdisciplinary.
Yeah, and so then we're like, oh, you can't do that. But to Jared's point a few minutes ago, I mean, in the grad class, we do novels later in the class, and I think it's because we're learning methodology and ways of reading other kinds of texts. Like Daniel's in that class, so we've spent some time thinking. Well, some of the texts they're not novels; they're literary. Might be a slave narrative. We spent some time thinking about how do you read a slave narrative? What kind of literary modes can you use? Or we've done Frederick Douglass's photography. We spent some time thinking about how do you read a photograph? Is that different? And we've read Foucault and Nicolas Mirzoff, The Right to Look, so that when we get to the novels, we're approaching them from a different perspective. If that makes sense. To your question, I'm hoping if you have training in different modes of reading not just like a straightforward reading of a novel, then that is helpful when you go on the job market. Now, I could be wrong. That would be more helpful than having, you can still read, having read the whole canon of whatever it is, 20th century American literature, in a grad seminar, if that makes sense. So hopefully in the seminars we're teaching you skills and methodologies and modes of reading, which then you can apply.
Yeah, my question, I hope that didn't come
Yeah,
across
no,
as
no,
like
no.
an indictment
Yeah,
or anything like
I
that,
didn't take it that way, but I do think it's interesting that a lot of our regular seminars don't focus on literature as such anymore.
Bhakti, you had your hand up.
No, it's not.
No?
I think
No.
someone said it.
No.
I was just going to reinforce that. In fact, it's not always about enrollment trajectory, but it is about disciplinary possessiveness. As someone who studies African literature and constantly asks, "Why aren't you in sociology or anthropology?" I mean, it's very intense, the proprietary nature of
Well,
disciplinary.
I mean, I would add to that so much of this conversation, and Wayne, you know this very well, I mean, part of the proprietary history of this came about with WGSS and Africana Studies and Alice. The institutes became actually the location by which CNC became far more finicky about what classes could and could not. I don't think those can be separated as, I mean, certainly what is now driving us is resource allocation and classes and all of that sort of thing, but the history of this is deeply embedded in an institutional resistance to the institutes on a broad spectrum. If you can block every single class from being admitted to the WGSS curriculum, you can literally push an entire program years and years behind, which is exactly what happened here at UConn. So, I mean, I don't think those can be imagined in different ways.
I just add to that history. I mean, Chris, you mentioned the SF state strike. So in the strikes that began Africana Studies, the idea was not to create interdisciplinarity to have a more holistic academic viewpoint of the subject. It was to have social responsibility that sort of brought different views and sort of solving real social problems. So this is another element that we need to think about. It's not just about having a more robust academic view on an academic topic, but actually just to kind of have some kind of connection with the real world and sort of solve problems out there in the community as well.
Did you have your hand up?
Oh yeah, I taught at two other institutions before this one, and there was a lot of opportunity for team teaching across disciplines, and it just seems to me that UConn doesn't facilitate that in any way. So I teach the graphic novel, and I know folks in art and art history have produced graphic novels. What is the pathway? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
For that kind of collaboration to benefit students? I mean, there's issues of like, well, do we count that as a half class for you and a half class for her, or do we, how do we allocate the seats and it just seems to be so being counterish and I don't know, counterintuitive, I guess.
Well, this is maybe a little bit more administrative detail than people want to know, but I just, since you're in the room, Jeffrey, I mean, the way that
Sorry,
the
Jeff.
board was head of CLA and CNC, explain it to me. If you have even one department that is really not cool with your class, they can kind of sink it, right? And it's so it does become a complete 100% consensus model in which you do have the finicky CNC rep that has a lot of power, right? And that I think could be simply reformed, right, just by the process. How these.
I think what they want is consultation.
Right.
And I can remember only one case where consultation didn't finally produce an outcome, a settlement, and that involves statistics. They often are at war with other departments who have studies of the statistics in their own discipline, and that finally was settled by the CLAS-CNC as a body. As I recall, they decided against statistics. They said, look, these things have a home in these other departments, you've just got to live with it. You can't have a monopoly on every course that has statistics in it in this department, in this university.
But I think, though, that a lot of the reason why some of those conflicts don't, it doesn't, have to go to a vote is because the proposer, and I've had to do this myself, ends up just self-policing and self-regulating to get it through, right? And so you're like, I don't want to have to, this giant fight, with all these units, so I'll just screw it. I'll just water it down and make it sound more boring than I like, just to get it through. I mean, I think that's how a lot of these things go through, right? And so I don't know. That's a bit much in the way of CNC detail probably, but it does seem like, it just in my experience, that's the block is in the teaching, you know, more so, and it's not even a hard block, but it's a block, you know, but less so than research in the publishing world. So.
How does one get the ability to teach a class with a person from another department here? Do you know how? Because I've also thought about it with history.
I think it would be possible. I mean, you'd have to get some kind of agreement between the departments. You might do it by having if it's a course that will take a large capacity, you could conceivably call it 2 sections meeting in the same room. One you'd have to make it a cross-listed course, but I think you could, if it were cross-listed, I think you could manage it. Jerry and I co-teach the rhetoric of political discourse, and we each get credit for a course because it's a W course, but instead of a capacity of 19, we call it a capacity of 38. So it's simply 2 W sections, so we each get credit. So there are things you can do
Even
to
across
work it out.
With another
Well,
department.
this of course was within a department, but I think across schools, I think it should be worked out. Jeff, what about the course that Gray teaches?
Right, so that's cross-listed across the School of Fine Arts.
Yeah.
And CLAS, and also has an HRI listing,
Yeah.
which is not in any school. So, yeah, I mean, you could do it. I mean, I think the easiest way that you can do it, that sort of, I guess you would call it under the radar, is to do it exactly as Hap is suggesting, which is to just teach the course, the 2 courses with the same number at the same time in the same room.
And then students enroll for either? Or
Yeah.
Another possibility is an honors core course. So they'll fund a freshman honors course.
Right. And we also have these
And pay both instructors and or defray the cost in their departments. So Walden was a course that was taught between history, earth science, English, and other areas.
There's also something called an interdepartmental class. I mean, there used to be, before my time, there was a course on the Bible that was taught by Jambeck,
Yeah.
Right.
Miller, and in philosophy, what's his name? Anyway, there were 3 faculty listed on that class.
Right. But the department would have to approve that INTD as a course, because I run a minor and I'm not able to teach the course that is the core course for the minor, diversity studies in American culture, because it's not an English cross-listed course. So when Bob Tilton was chair, I would petition, and that would be how it would. So it's the counting of where does it go and how does it fit in that becomes.
And the larger point is still the valid one, which is it shouldn't be that onerous, right? It shouldn't be that tricky to do this.
Right.
Right? It should be easier.
We're almost doing it like secretly, under the radar.
Yeah.
Let's do it this way.
Can I ask
It should be encouraged to teach.
I just want to ask a question of the audience, actually. And this comes to the matter of the unique position of English with respect to disciplinarity, and whether English has a unique obligation as a discipline that concerns itself with the study and structure of discourses, if English has a unique obligation to interrogate or promote interdisciplinarity, but on the basis of its antecedent existence as the study of discursive formations. I mean, maybe it's the case that that's not a unique province of English, and I'd like to hear that if people have views on this. But, I mean, the paper that I gave, and the reason why I gave that paper, some of you are probably like, why is he talking about this? I mean, like when I think about the work that I do, I'm just constantly honestly thinking about different ways in which knowledge is produced. And in the 18th century, the savage is a locus of meaning that enables the production and, frankly, differentiation of disciplines. Sociology, anthropology, economics, politics, this figure is common across what will eventually be these different disciplines. And I think that that's something that I do that someone in another discipline probably isn't going to do. So for example, I mean, if I'm going to teach Locke, what I'm going to say about Locke is fundamentally different than what a philosopher is going to say about Locke. And the kind of questions that I ask of Locke are fundamentally different than the kinds of questions that a philosopher asks about Locke. So I guess I'm wondering if English has a unique obligation in terms of question of disciplinary?
I think so, and always have. And just a moment, and for me, this is actually part of my interest in developing the thing called the WAT, the Writing Across Technologies Initiative, for first-year writing, because it's both about sort of keeping sort of breaking the course apart, so there are two pieces that move against each other, and so students go off also in the studio lab and they work collaboratively. They cannot write alone, they have to collaborate on projects in that space together across classes together.
So from the perspective of writing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I agree.
But writing is a solo act, but writing is more than just a solo act.
When you go into, I mean, I don't know, I'm sorry, don't recognize a few faces, it seems like mostly English people, but I don't know what department are you in?
Just history people.
Okay, I mean, well, and if there's a discipline where what I'm saying does not apply, it would be in history.
I think you could say, I don't think
what do you think about that?
English is uniquely more unique. I think every discipline,
Yeah.
you know, and I was thinking when Chris was talking, we were also in this writing group where these issues have come up. I remember you and Martha, I thought it was, I would call it ridiculing historians for the need to go to an archives.
No.
teasing us that we were so obsessed with archives. But I was thinking of these disciplines have sort of standards that may be more in methods, not so much what it is, what text you're reading, but how you approach that text.
Right.
And those are maybe hard to explain to people, but you know, I work in Native American history. Certainly I'm a bit familiar with what you were talking about. And historians would write about that also.
Yeah.
But you did it very differently than a historian would, and it's hard to actually put your finger on what that difference is.
Yeah.
I would say too, I'm also in the history department, and I'm somebody that is interested in the U.S. as a hub for global capitalism. And so one of the things that I push against that I struggle with is some of those issues with archives, which is if I want to study a particular company in the 1980s, it's going to have workers in China, California, Mexico, you know, Dominican Republic. I'm not going to be able to go to the archives in all of those places and read all of those languages in order to be able to study the history of this company, yet I don't want just the official history of this company, so I don't want to just use their archives. So at some point, and this came up at a labor and working class history conference where I was at a labor and empire panel, and there was somebody there that studies like the US in the post-World War II era in Japan, Korea, and Indochina, Vietnam. And he said, you know, and his answer to that was that you have to read deep historiography then across regions because you're not going to learn all those languages and be able to travel all those places. But I still find myself pushing against that because people ask me, well, you're studying Southern mill hands and Caribbean, you know, garment workers. Like, those are two different things. And it's uncomfortable being outside conventions, though. I'm a pretty kind of unconventional person in general, and so that's one of the things I was going to say is like to be an interdisciplinary person, you have to go into it knowing that you're pushing against these frameworks and be comfortable with that, because if you're not, you're just going to end up miserable. But I like a good fight. So.
And I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, you know, when I've done a lot of work mostly in the history of economics, and I mean, when an economist comes on the scene and starts investigating the foundations of economics as a discipline, everyone is, you know, up in arms and astonished that someone is even daring to sort of look into these questions. I mean, it's pretty rare. Like, there are people who work in economics departments that do that, but not many. Like, and when a book comes out, it's a big deal if it's of any merit. I would imagine that it's much more extreme in the social sciences than in history, for example, art history.
And I think it seems like in these writing groups that I've been a part of, where there's English folks and historians, and even in my own seminars, my own American Studies background and history seminars, there's a very different kind of mode of argumentation, even within those, even when you do historicist work from within an English department, in the sense that, you know, the cliche that I think it's becoming a little bit looser is, I mean, I think why I initially went into an English department, because initially I thought there was more kind of freedom of movement in the sense that you could use critical theory a lot more, and you can make kind of, you know, wider, more expansive arguments, or so it seemed kind of at first. Whereas with history, you really do have to kind of make your argument, not just on the archive, but upon a whole range of texts. You can't just do a literature dissertation where you do a close reading of like 2 novels and that's your thing. That would be kind of laughed out of a history department, I sense, right? Even if you're trying to make a historical argument. So I think it's a cliche, I think, to say still at this point that in English we do close reading, but I think there's still kind of afterlives of that in the way that we approach text, right? In the sense that we do more rhetorical analysis of a given passage, I would say, on average, right? Or we are a little bit more attentive to the way the language is structured and how that might tie to a particular kind of a critical theory around race or something like this. But that said, I mean, I find myself, maybe this is why the last book was marketed in history, I think I really did stop doing close reading, and I was really just focusing on tons and tons and tons of text in order to make my argument. I think I spent at most 3 pages on a single text, right? And so that's, and you know, in an American Studies context, I mean, I think the way that we would do it is kind of similar to what you did. It also is just a kind of a more, well, not a more, but a theoretically attuned, rhetorically tuned study of historical phenomenon that nonetheless makes kind of arguments based on a specific time period, but maybe goes about that in a little bit more differently. But I've since I've been around more historians, I've like dispensed with this idea that one discipline is expansive and one is like particular. I don't think that works like that at all. Yeah, it's just
certain
very
traditions
different.
that they
right.
have create these expectations.
Right.
I was in graduate school with a historian, Sarah Evans, where she was my teacher, but she had written a book, The Personal is Political. She wrote a book about her own experience as a woman in SDS, and her book was based on oral histories, and she had to fight the whole time to get that book accepted. You know, it became a major work eventually, and it captured that sort of history of the late 60s and the women's movement very well. But her committee didn't like it. She got all this backlash about, you know, so these things are always in contestation. But I do think the traditions of the methods of the disciplines, the ways of seeing, is still really strong.
What counts as evidence?
Yes, how you construct an argument.
Yeah.
We're very atheoretical, and that's been my experience. I'm so grateful all of you in the American Studies writing group are not harping on us all the time about who our theoreticians are, you know, which
Apparently we mock you.
I'd rather be mocked. We're going to archives.
We go to archives.
But yeah, we don't use theory at all. And my sense is that would still be an expectation, that you are kind of upfront with where your ideas are coming from. Our big prize winners use no theory. They make no reference to theory. They tell stories. And this is what these publishers are wanting in history now.
Yes.
So we're getting a backlash too against the sort of historical analysis unless it tells a story. So it's happening to us too, but it's happening in a very different way.
Very interesting figure in all of this is Rebecca Spang. I don't know if you know her work. She's the director of the Center for 18th Century Studies at Indiana University. She's a historian and she's gone to ASEX for several years, which is principally literary studies. But she's won the major ASEX prize twice. She's the only person to ever do so, the book prize, basically book of the year. So she's a really interesting person in sort of thinking about the relationship between the disciplines.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, one of the things that I've found interesting is that I've been looking at the job market recently, and there's at a lot of the smaller schools or small liberal arts colleges, they're more open to interdisciplinarity, but a lot of their jobs, if it's being posted as interdisciplinary, they want people now to have like a certificate from Wiggs or a certificate from American Studies or a certificate. So it's this hard spot I find where, you know, doing a PhD, you have so many requirements already, and then now if you want to make yourself like, you know, open to this, like the work I do is interdisciplinary in the sense like I do cultural history and political economic history with women's and feminist theory and stuff. But like I never got a certificate. So now it's like, it's this weird, nothing's been resolved yet. So it's like you go in the job market, if you're from a traditional PhD program, you have very traditional frameworks, and yet there's many jobs out there that are no longer being bound particularly by those. And so I think that that's going to be a problem for, traditional PhD programs in the future, is to not just layer on more certificates or more requirements, but to actually, like Chris had said, start to actually open up more just interdisciplinary work without necessarily having everything be required. And I wondered, how can graduate students deal with those realities with the job market too?
Well, this is something I tell folks in the 5160, that's our professionalization class here over and over, which is that, the book publishing market honors and expects interdisciplinarity, but the job market will expect maybe that as a flourish, but you really do have to make yourself legible within English departments, meaning you have to make very clear that your dissertation, focuses on authors that are familiar. You have to make its Englishness very kind of clear from the outset. So it is there's a kind of schizophrenia in the institutional demands, with the job market demanding one thing, maybe even tenure requirements demanding one thing, and then, publishing doing another thing. So, that's why I said I think I had more freedom to do what I really wanted to do, kind of post-tenure, but I would say there's not 100% unfreedom there too, which is why I still pitch American Studies certificates to graduate students, because, partly it does make you look good. You just have to make yourself legible within both. For models though of how it can be done otherwise, in liberal arts colleges, I taught at Hampshire College a little while, and that was something founded out of the Port Huron Statement in the 60s, and it was very, albeit cost $50,000 a year, but the department was Humanities, Arts, Cultural Studies. That was just one department, or and I know, UCSD, their English department, you could do this differently too. It's just literature, right? That was the famous thing that Jameson had put forth there, where it's all of the languages, not just English. And so that raises the question, why do we just have an English department rather than just a literature department with all languages there, right? Well, because LCL would flip out if you merged, and maybe we don't want to live with them either. So there's that kind of institutional reality too, but there's ways to do it.
All right. Thanks for our speakers, and please help yourself to food and informal conversation. Let's thank for our speakers.